Welcome to the Communication Research Colloquium Series. Come on in, please. There's some seats, still a few in the front and some in the back as well. Welcome again, everyone. This is, I think, the fourth talk in our series this semester, where again, in the Colloquium Series, we try to highlight communication-based research from individuals within the College of Communication, as well as sometimes external visitors. Today we have with us Dr. Kelsey Prena from the Department of Film and Television. A few items I wanted to mention before we get started. One would be, because we are recording the talk to share with other individuals, because the cameras tend to pick up additional noise, we request that all laptops be put away rather than typing. It's more than fine to take notes with pen and pencil. I know that many of you are here as SONA participants. Show of hands.
Good choice.
You picked a really good one. But also that you have, in turn, a writing assignment associated with your visit today. We urge you to take notes if you'd like, but please just not on laptops, okay? As a point of introduction, I'd like to introduce our guest here. I'm going to read and make sure I get the details correct. Dr. Prena is a member of the Film and Television Department here in COM, where she conducts research on the neurological effects of video gameplay. In particular, she focuses on how video gaming influences learning and memory, and how past experiences can lead to differences in emotional affect. One of the goals of this work is to extend video game effects research to people with Down syndrome, and in order to do that, in turn, better understand how video games can facilitate memory. Today, Dr. Prena will be sharing with us some of her recent research on this topic. If you would, please join me in welcoming Dr. Prena.
Thank you guys. Can you all hear me in the back? Yes. Awesome. I declined a microphone, so I just wanted to make sure that everyone can hear me whether or not I'm wearing a microphone. As Dr. Cummings introduced me, I am Dr. Prena here at Boston University. This is my first year, and I'm going to be talking about some of the research that I've done on video game play. That tends to be a hot topic. I'm wondering, maybe that's what brought some extra people in today? In which case, you're right in choosing this because I think it's really interesting, but I might be biased because it's my research. For this talk today, I'm going to be giving a huge overarching talk, rather than really specific detail, about how video games can influence memory and what that looks like within the brain itself. Okay, as I am a games researcher, I thought that it was important to try to find a way to gamify the talk today. What does gamify mean? Dr. Cummings teaches a class on it. Any guesses? Gamify. Could it be turning something into a game? There we go, we got it. I figured that we could kind of look at my research as a sort of game, where each contribution, each project, lends itself to a greater view of the game map. So that's how I'm going to be presenting my research today. We're going to start with game mechanics, or essentially the rules that I follow in my research. I'll present the game map. I'll actually present that at every step. We're going to be seeing a game map and how more and more of the game map is unlocked. We have 3 different levels. We have a game mechanics and memory level, an underlying neural code. So rather than perhaps programming code for the game itself, we have a neural code for the brain, as well as resulting emotion. What happens when you play this game? We'll also see conclusions in future research. Let's start with game mechanics. Does anybody know what game mechanics are? No guess. Yeah.
There are different sort of like rules and things that change like your experience playing the game. So a game mechanic might be that you like can't die, or that you when you die you're set back to a specific spot.
Exactly. It's like she's my research assistant. Game mechanics are the specific rules that you have to follow to engage in the video game world, right? And so, for instance, in Sonic Adventure 2, which happens to be one of my games of interest, you press A and Sonic jumps. That's a rule of the game, and your interaction within it is how Mario behaves, or how Sonic behaves. When you press A, Sonic jumps. Another one, how do you move around in this world, right? In this game map that we're looking at, how do you move? Sonic Adventure 2, you move the joystick and Sonic moves, right? Pretty intuitive. Okay, let's think about now the actual brain. I study a very, very particular region in the brain. It's called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is right in the center of your brain, so it's not like I can really point to it. But we'll see a picture later about where the hippocampus is actually located. The hippocampus is what motivates us to explore the pursuit of a reward. So when we're in this environment, whether it's in the game or in real life, and we anticipate a reward, our hippocampus starts to activate. Now, it's really active all the time, but we see heightened activation when we're in the pursuit of a reward. This is called anticipatory reward. It's when we're anticipating this reward that we're hoping to achieve. We can see this in mice when they're learning an environment and learning where potential rewards are occurring in the environment. We also see this in humans. We've actually put humans in the fMRI scanner while they are navigating a game map, and as people approach the reward, if they know where it is or think they know where it is, we see heightened hippocampal activation. Interestingly, this relates strongly to spatial mapping. This might make sense to you. It's the idea of navigating your environment to achieve the reward that you're anticipating, right? And so you have to be able to remember where it's located, remember what steps you took to get to the reward that you're hoping to get to. It also relates to declarative memory. Declarative memory is the memorization of facts and associations. This might be a little bit farther away from spatial memory when we're talking about the anticipatory reward. But it's remembering details. What two words go together? What sign in your environment told you that you are where you are, right? Maybe you recognize this room based on the posters on the side of the wall. If you've had a class in here before. You probably, if you have had a class in here, either have really good memories or really bad memories. Maybe you learned a lot and you loved the professor, and so you have positive memories about this. And every time you come into this classroom, anticipatory reward starts triggering. You're excited to come back. Or maybe you had bad memories and you weren't so excited to come back. In which case, hopefully this talk might revert some of those bad feelings. We'll see. Declarative memory is really exciting to me because declarative memory can be used to measure anticipatory reward. As people anticipate reward, declarative memory is facilitated. Or in other words, as reward anticipation goes up, declarative memory goes up. So people remember more upon anticipating a reward than they would if they don't expect a reward and they're not thinking about the potential for a reward. So this is what I have particularly focused on in my research, is this idea that anticipatory reward leads to facilitated memory after gaming. You play the game, you either get the reward or you're close to getting the reward, and then we interrupt you, and we test your memory performance. But a lot of recent research, including my own, is arguing that spatial mapping does have a role in this too. When you're anticipating reward, spatial memory is facilitated. We also see that when you're pursuing, or when you're conducting spatial mapping, you also have facilitated declarative memory. So these ideas, these functions of the hippocampus aren't mutually exclusive. They're all complementing each other. So generally we see this facilitated hippocampal activation, and then as a result we see, well, anticipatory reward likely leads to hippocampus activation, and then from there spatial mapping and declarative memory are facilitated. Do we have any questions about that before we move on? I know I'm going to have time for questions at the end, but this is particularly, these are our game mechanics, so we need to understand them in order to play the game, right? Yeah.
I have a question about the change in declarative memory, especially since the overall attitude to gameplay has changed, where people don't just play to finish it, sometimes they play for different purposes, and sometimes people play it multiple times over. Do you know if there's been any change in any, like, brain chemistry, essentially, the number of times they run through the same gameplay?
Yeah, that's a good question. So she asked, does the brain change after multiple times playing the game? And there is actually a lot of research suggesting that it does change. And so as long as you're still anticipating reward, but reward isn't a given, so you're not achieving reward 100% of the time, but you're close to it, you're going to see heightened hippocampal activity. If you know what's going to happen, you can respond, and you know you're going to get past it, you don't see heightened hippocampal activity, because it's no longer rewarding to have that achievement. You're just trying to get past it. Awesome question. Now, Dr. Cummings mentioned, oh yeah.
Another question. Does the anticipatory reward drive addiction?
That's a good question. Does anticipatory reward drive addiction? And there is only a link in that it's a similar activity. And so we don't actually know what will lead particularly to addiction, right? We know that anticipatory reward can lead to gameplay, but there's a fine line there that hasn't quite been achieved in research yet. Great question. Dr. Cummings, when he introduced me, said that I study Down syndrome research. Interestingly, in people with Down syndrome, there is oftentimes, but not always, a deficit in declarative memory. When we get to the underlying neurocode, we'll talk about that more. But this relationship really fascinated me. So if video games can lead to anticipatory reward, which leads to facilitated declarative memory, can the same process occur in people with Down syndrome to facilitate declarative memory? It's a question that I'm still trying to answer, but again, we'll talk about it a little bit further when we get to neurocode. Level 1, our first game map. As I just mentioned, we have video gameplay, right? And that anticipatory reward during video gameplay activates the hippocampus, and the hippocampus activating leads to facilitated declarative memory. Well, nobody had done that yet when I started my research. And so I thought, this makes sense. So let's run an experiment and see if we can actually see this happening. For comm scholars, they may recognize excitation transfer theory. This is the idea that the media that you consume will have lingering effects on the behaviors that you engage in and the processing that occurs after consuming media. So originally it was horror films, and how feelings of horror films then can lead to different information processing events after consuming in the media. Have you ever seen a really scary film and then you can't leave your bed?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's this excitation transfer theory, transferring from the media world into the world that you're behaving in after media consumption. And so I said that through excitation transfer theory, we can predict that heightened activation during gaming can lead to heightened activation of the hippocampus in a later processing task. In this case, it was a declarative memory task. What I did for this first study was I had them play a video game for 30 minutes, and then I pulled them out of the game and gave them a memory task. They had to memorize a list of words. And then after the memory task, I gave them busy work, essentially, for 30 minutes, and then asked them to recall the words that we had initially been exposed to after gaming. I had 4 different video game conditions that varied by rewards and spatial navigation. And so what I had here was that rewards present, so in a game where there were very obvious rewards, gaining coins, overcoming bosses, gaining levels or achieving levels, navigating the world successfully. So I had a rewards present and spatial navigation present task. Again, spatial navigation does come into play a little bit, but it's this idea that spatial mapping does involve the hippocampus, and so can we piece that apart in any meaningful way? I also had a rewards absent but spatial navigation present video game. This game was Proteus. Anybody play Proteus? Good, probably good. Proteus is a beautiful game. It has beautiful music and interesting scenery, but you're just honestly bodiless figure going through a world. So you're kind of navigating this world, but nothing meaningful. There is no reward. Nothing to be achieved other than navigating this space. We also had rewards present, but spatial navigation absent video game. This was Galaga. Every time I go to an arcade now, Galaga is my favorite game to play because of this study. Essentially, Galaga, you're just navigating a spaceship, shooting aliens, and so you're not navigating a 3D world, but rather just a tiny little space to shoot the aliens from. So rewards present, but spatial navigation absent. And then we have rewards absent and spatial navigation absent video game Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo. Does anybody recognize that game? Hey, I actually played it when I was little, which is why I remembered it for this study. And actually had access to it, and we could use an Xbox 360 controller for this game. We used an Xbox 360 controller for all of the games. Putt-Putt Saves the Zoo has a coloring feature where you pick a color and drop it into a space. It was not very stimulating. I had a couple of participants actually say, "I can't believe you had me do that for 30 minutes." To my face. But that's the idea that there's no reward and no spatial navigation, but it's still taking the form of a video game-esque task. Unfortunately, in this study, we didn't really see an effect of spatial navigation on memory, but we did have a really interesting effect on the presence or absence of video game play, as well as weekly gaming. So regardless of what condition they were in, rewards present or rewards absent, hours of weekly gaming predicted memory. And so as they played more games weekly, they remembered more of the words on their list. We also see an effect of reward. 0 in this case is reward absent. 1, or the red line, is rewards present. And so we see that rewards present participants remembered more words than rewards absent participants. There might be a couple of people in here who like numbers, so I decided to throw those numbers up. In a 2x2 ANOVA, this is our F of 6.75, adjusted R squared of 0.12, and then P is 0.002. I wasn't sure what the audience was going to be like, so I thought, comm scholars would want to see this. For rewards absent versus rewards present conditions, we see about 1 word difference represented in our study. So people on average remembered, which is actually surprisingly a lot, a whole word difference. And so we see that rewards immediately before memory can facilitate memory, as well as weekly gaming facilitates memory. So I would call that a win. I guess maybe it's a little different, but for me that's quite intrinsically rewarding to have predicted the effects. Okay, so that was level 1. Like I said, every step of this process unleashed a little bit more of the game map. So our game map for level 2, this is our game map from level 1, right? So it looks identical here. But now, if you remember from the overview, we're looking at the underlying neural code. So we're introducing 2 neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals in the brain that cause the different regions of your brain to either activate or suppress. In the hippocampus, GABA is our major inhibitor, meaning that it causes the hippocampus to suppress. Activation decreases. Dopamine in the hippocampus tends to act as an excitatory neurotransmitter, meaning that as dopamine increases, activation increases. They are not antagonists of one another, so it is not as one goes up, the other goes down. But we do see that GABA can have a little bit of a regulatory role on dopamine excitation in the hippocampus. So as GABA increases, we see suppression of dopamine and a suppression of the hippocampus itself. There's something called the reward cascade in the hippocampus. The reward cascade suggests that during anticipation, wow, I can't say that word today. When we are anticipating a reward, GABA will decrease to allow for hippocampal activation. And this should lead to memory. Again, nobody had done that. And so I said, well, I think I could do that. My underlying desire to look at Down syndrome played a role in this. People with Down syndrome actually have overproduction of GABA in the hippocampus. And so not only do we see that they have a deficit in declarative memory performance, but they also have overproduction of GABA, meaning that the hippocampus is suppressed more frequently. And so my argument here would be, in this game map, that as video game reward is experienced and anticipated, GABA will decrease to facilitate memory. Well, what about dopamine? Dopamine is very difficult to get at, and you can't get at dopamine using an fMRI. And so for now, that's why it's in parentheses, we're hoping that we can see this in video gameplay. People have reported increases in dopamine during video gameplay around the hippocampus. But for this study, we're looking particularly at GABA concentrations. Interestingly, there is a complementary theory to excitation transfer theory, but for neuroscience. This is called memory's penumbra hypothesis. This is saying that lingering activation projects onto other tasks through dopamine. And so as that hippocampus gets activated, GABA is suppressed and dopamine is increased. We should see that effect for some time after the sometime after anticipating a reward. So these complement each other, right? Excitation transfer theory is saying that as you experience media, your processing is changed and influenced by that media after you exit the media. Well, the same thing with memory's penumbra hypothesis. As you experience a decrease in dopamine, that processing will be facilitated after obtaining that reward. So that is what I set out to do. Again, before I forget, spatial mapping we can't let go of because it does have an influence on the hippocampus, and like I said, increasingly we see that it is very difficult to pull apart spatial mapping and reward when we're looking at hippocampal behavior. With this research, there's a lot of research suggesting that the hippocampus also changes based on your experience with spatial mapping in something called gray matter. In this case, gray matter increases as people get stronger at spatial mapping. And we've actually seen that in video game play and video game training, gray matter volume increases as you go through the video game training. And so I said, yes, I'm looking at GABA particularly, but while we're here, while we have people in the scanner for 2 hours, we might as well also look at hippocampal gray matter. So we ran something called an MR spectroscopy, or a magnetic resonance spectroscopy. This is allowing us to go deep into the brain and actually measure these neurotransmitters as they're processing the media. This voxel represents the hippocampus. This is the actual voxel we use. This is a picture of compiled participants, essentially, to show where we looked at the hippocampus in the brain over the hippocampus. I don't know that it particularly, I guess in this one you can see the hippocampus a little bit. This like squiggly figure here. If you really squint, maybe those in the back can't see it. But this figure here is the hippocampus. We did have to capture more than just the hippocampus. That's because hippocampi are shaped weird. And so you can't really capture simply the hippocampus. And so we just wanted to make sure we're capturing the whole hippocampus. Looks pretty, right? Thanks. What does this mean? Oh geez. We resonate, our capture resonates the magnet in order to see changes in brain behavior, essentially. The GABA peak is here at 2.0. And so we were looking at the area under the curve, or in this case, above the curve, of 2.0 to capture our GABA concentration. So, we had people in the scanner, had them play the game. And we didn't find very much, unfortunately, after gaming, but we did find before gaming, in initial scans, non-gamers had more GABA than gamers. Well, this would explain the relationship that we just saw where gamers performed declarative memory tasks better, regardless of what condition they were in, right? Is because hippocampal GABA is higher in non-gamers, meaning that the hippocampus is likely suppressed a little more in non-gamers than in gamers. Now, it is a tiny effect. So if you're thinking you need to go run and play video games, I say yes. I'm in support of that. But really, it is a small effect. And as already mentioned in this presentation, there is addiction, gaming addiction, and so we need to make sure that we are moderating our gameplay. Again, for the numbers, you can see that the difference between non-gamers and gamers in GABA is tiny. I even threw in an extra decimal. And so in trying to understand the effects of spatial mapping and video gameplay on spatial mapping, I also looked at gray matter. And what we see here is that gamers had significantly more gray matter than non-gamers. This confirms other studies and confirms parts of our literature review, but we found this to be an interesting effect. And so, likely, there is some sort of influence of spatial mapping during gaming that ends up affecting the hippocampus. Now, as I mentioned, there's a little bit of, we see a slight effect of gaming on the hippocampus before and after gaming, but we're still working on putting that argument together, and it has not been peer-reviewed yet. So I want to talk to you about it, but as of now, I can't, so please email me in about a month for what happened there between before gaming and after gaming GABA concentrations. Spoiler alert, I'm excited about it. So, level 2, got to the end of that level, right? On to our third and final level, unleashing more and more of this game map that I walked through. So, this should look similar. This is our game map from level 2. Let's add some things. So in communication research, one of our core theories, at least in media psychology, is the LC4MP, limited capacity model of mediated messages. There's another M in there somewhere. This suggests that emotion can influence how we process the information around us, which also makes sense for this argument, that perhaps you need to be able to see video games as reward to experience the reward, and that will influence memory. You need to be approaching the reward instead of avoiding the reward, which is a common idea in the LC4MP research. And so, for my third and final project, I wanted to look at emotion. What happens to emotion when we are experiencing a video gameplay? And in fact, I said, I know enough about this reward to suggest what kinds of conditions might lead to differences in emotion that will lead to differences in memory. Before I move on, I want to point out that in communication and in neuroscience even, we're working with the studies that we have, right? Well, there's a core study in communication neuroscience that has connected the hippocampal activation to negative affect. So as negative affect goes up, hippocampal activation goes down. And so I thought, well, that makes sense for my argument, right? Frustration goes up, reward goes down, perception of reward goes down, therefore hippocampal activation will go down. Again, spatial mapping is a little bit of an interesting debate. You can actually find heated debates from neuroscientists about the role that the hippocampus plays in reward for spatial mapping procedures. And so I thought, let's look at this a little more in something called goal-directed spatial decision-making. It's the idea that in the pursuit of reward, you are remembering what you have already learned to help you guide decisions to advance you towards the goal. In my mind, it's the perfect combination of hippocampal functions complementing one another. We see this aspect of spatial processing, we see this anticipatory reward processing, and we see memory, remembering the path that you took to achieve the reward. So, I decided to create my own video game conditions using Super Mario Maker. And what I did with that is I manipulated this goal-directed spatial decision-making mechanic. This is a big graph, we'll get through it. I created 4 different video game conditions. My first video game condition was called the Setback punishment mechanic. This is where, when you're playing a video game and you lose, you go back to the beginning of the level. This is what happens usually during Super Mario Brothers games, right? You fail and so you get sent back to the beginning of the level. This incorporates the goal-directed spatial decision-making task. But it also influences your progression. So progression within the setback punishment is obvious. You know where you've been before and where you need to get to. That leads to reward, right? And so there's potential for reward because as you struggle to get past a certain obstacle, you find it rewarding to pass that obstacle. There's also an opportunity for punishment. When you fail, right, if you can't successfully complete the jump that you have to complete, you have to start at the beginning of the level. I also had something called the point of death condition. This is where when the player died, or when Mario died, it's an important specification. When Mario died, they no longer navigated back to the point that or to the beginning of the level. They instead were returned to where they had just died. Game progression is still clear because they know where they've been and where they're going. And there is still an opportunity for punishment. It's just that you can't advance in the level. And that you fail, and so you have to retry the level, or that particular obstacle again. So it's the difference of experiencing the whole obstacle, or the whole level, or returning to the obstacle at which you just failed. Random replacement, the players were put in a random space when they failed. So there was not this linear progression, and progression was not conceptualized in a way that you'd understand that progress is meaningful. You just kept changing your experience. The game environment kept changing, so you couldn't follow a linear progression. So what we see is that there's no goal-directed spatial decision-making, no clear game progression, but there is the opportunity for failure. The opportunity for failure comes when you're working on a level and the well, you can't repeat that obstacle, and so therefore you don't get the satisfaction of overcoming it. Instead, you're just pushed to a new obstacle, what felt like a new level. And then finally, in the invincibility condition, they just ran. There was no dying, right? We covered all the jumps. We took out everything other than the world itself so they couldn't die. Well, this had no goal-directed spatial decision making. There was nothing to remember. There was no there was clear game progression, but it was constant. And so you just kept progressing. It wasn't perceived as a reward. And then finally, reward uncertainty. There was no discipline. So there wasn't an opportunity for punishment. So now we had them play this for 30 minutes, and then we gave them the same memory task, remembering a list of words. Interestingly, there was an effect of gender on memory. The point of death condition and the setback punishment condition were significantly different for females, where females in the point of death condition performed significantly poorer on the task than females in the setback punishment condition. This was really exciting for me. This was what I'd hoped to see, that the setback punishment condition made a difference. However, we saw an interesting interaction effect with gender. Females performed significantly poorer in the point of death condition than males. And so we had this crisscross, where females were better in the setback punishment and poorer in the point of death condition, but males were better in the point of death condition. All I can explain from that is that, yes, the goal-directed spatial decision-making did make a difference. But we looked at a couple other things too. I wanted to make sure that our memory measurement was consistent with the last study, or 2 studies ago now. And so I thought declarative memory should correlate with weekly gaming. And we saw that, which was a relief. It was scary, but it was okay. We ended up finding a significant relationship again. And I mentioned that a different communication neuroscholar has looked at hippocampal activation and negative affect, meaning that the negative emotions that you feel, as negative emotions increase, hippocampal activation decreases. And so I thought, if this is the case, then as negative affect increases, we should see a decrease in declarative memory performance. That was also supported. And so now we can say that negative affect can predict declarative memory. Negative affect after gaming influenced declarative memory performance. Now, I told you there was something special about this setback punishment mechanic. So what I did was I created a bunch of different mechanics. I created scales to measure participants' preferences for each one of those mechanics. And I looked at how those mechanics could predict declarative memory. They included invincibility. So do people like games where they can just keep running? They included casual gaming, which we'll see in a second. Casual gaming being that you could start and stop almost whenever you want. They're short games that you can just play at your leisure. I also had object tracking, which is following the object on a screen. The only condition that correlated, or the only lifetime experience with the mechanic, the only mechanic that correlated with declarative memory was this setback punishment mechanic. And this is for all participants, including a non-gaming control group that we didn't look at in the past slides. Here I specified, well, their lifetime experience might be different from what they're currently playing right now. And so I also asked them for what are you playing right now? What preferences do you have right now versus a long time ago? Interestingly, preference for casual games was the only mechanic that they're playing right now that was able to predict declarative memory. So this introduces a new feature, casual gaming. Interesting. We also found that past experiences with different types of games can lead to different emotions during gameplay. This yields itself to a very complicated matrix that I don't have time to talk about today, but I love talking about and would love to continue talking with you more about it. Essentially, we saw that differences in enjoyment, differences in frustration, and differences in how many levels they achieved during gaming in this participant could be explained by past preferences with video games. So in our final game map, we can see that there's evidence of gaming reward in the hippocampus through better memory, as we predicted in our level 1 game map, and GABA parentheses around dopamine in our second game map. We can also argue that the relationship is tied to spatial navigation because we saw the impact that goal-directed spatial decision-making had on, at the very least, female gamers. We also saw that emotion influences not only memory, but other experiences during gaming, like I said. So past experiences and past emotion with other games led to current experiences with the game that I presented to them. And that the relationship is linked to mechanic-specific effects, like I said, current preferences, and negative affect, or especially negative affect, and past experiences. Now, there are some limitations to my research. I only looked at hippocampal GABA concentrations, and we have not clearly drawn the link between hippocampal changes of GABA and memory. That seems like an obvious connection. I'm working on that project right now. There's also huge variation in gameplay. So you think about how one person experiences gameplay, it's going to be completely different from how the next person experiences gameplay. And in my research, the research becomes meaningful when we can generalize it to everybody. But that doesn't mean that there isn't huge variation in gameplay that we should continue to look into. What other explanations are there for these changes in declarative memory as a result of gameplay? Oops. We have fairly homogeneous samples. Something that I forgot to mention during my GABA study was that it was only males. It was a small sample of only males. And they're between the ages of 18 and 25, easily accessible at a university, right? And so we can only generalize these results to small groups of people. I mentioned in the beginning that I'm interested in Down syndrome research. I have been lucky enough to research people with Down syndrome in the past, and I hope to again in the future. But we need to establish this relationship first in typically developing peers because accessibility is far easier than exuding all my resources currently. And then finally, reward versus spatial navigation is something that we have to continue to piece apart. This is something that I was really excited about with BU. We actually have a lab here at Boston University in the neuroscience department who are currently working on that and using virtual worlds to do it. So with that, my future research, working out this argument. When is it reward? When is it spatial navigation? Or is it a hybrid like what we saw with goal-directed spatial decision-making? I would love to extend my research to long-term memory. So yes, we saw that in 30 minutes, memory was affected by gameplay. What if we extend that to 24 hours? Or 1 week later? We need to specify further the video game demands that are important for memory. And what experiences do you have with those video game demands that lead you to approach the video games differently? I would love to continue my research on neural activation patterns in play. So what happens when we play video games? And then how does that influence memory afterward? And then finally extending it to other populations. Gonna let people take pictures. Thank you guys for having me. For hosting this, as well as my labs that I was a part of in conducting this research. Both are over at Indiana University, Cognitive Neuroimaging Lab, as well as the Institute for Communication Research. I think there's 5 minutes for questions. So, are there any questions? Yeah.
So I'm sort of interested in, when you said Mario dies, I was just thinking, is there an emotional reaction to that? Is it the fact that, there's Mario lunchboxes and the kids go trick-or-treating as Mario?
Yeah.
Is there any sort of connection between how you feel and the connection with the character with rewards and...
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't know if you heard Patrice's question, but it was, what about your feelings towards Mario? We did record feeling towards Mario in past experience with Mario and found no effects. That doesn't mean that they could affect memory and your emotion, but that in our particular study we couldn't find anything linked. Yeah.
I imagine, did you track people's success with their gameplay throughout the MRI?
That's a good question. So in the MRI, we actually we did track success. And that is a before and after question, and that is not peer reviewed yet. But we did find something interesting there too. Yeah, gotcha.
With the data level thing, I'm guessing it's one of those Lord behavior type things where over a long time, you play video game for your level of jobs. Correct me if I'm wrong with it. My question is, if they stop playing games for a long time, does that level rise back up?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. Well, we don't know in our study. So causality was a big issue here, where were gamers anticipating playing the game, and so that's why they had decreased GABA levels. We can't say right now, but we do know that dopamine does return to a baseline. Generally. Yeah. Aaron.
Are there limits to the memory capacity, or is that just
I'm sure there are limits, but I have not explored those limits. But yeah, so we have 15 words in our particular procedure, and I think one person remembered all 15 words before and after, and so that's just to show that even these high gamers, there's a limit.
with regards to the counseling, you said there's a deficit. Is that in terms of activation specific or in terms of quantity?
Well, we believe activation, but this overproduction of GABA is limiting activation. Yeah. Good questions. Anything else? There's still 3 minutes left.
So I know this is part of your future research, but do you think the relationship between gameplay and memory will apply to children whose brains will be positive development?
That's a really good question. So Dr. Guo asked whether or not this mechanic could apply to children, and that's something that we don't know right now. But I'd love to look into that in the future. Cascade.
Yeah, following up on that, this might sound like a really stupid notion, but is it possible that if you get accustomed to this kind of anticipatory reward process in order to enhance your memory, that affects it? And my husband has horrible memory in general.
Yeah.
But he's a real big gamer.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder.
It's funny because it's the opposite for my
You're
husband.
training a certain mechanism in your brain to
Only remember this
memory in a
particular.
certain way rather than another way.
Yeah.
I guess that's more of a long-term.
Yeah, I would say that looking at what kinds of games they're playing would be a fair argument. So we saw this effect of setback punishment on memory, and so we didn't see that in perhaps object tracking or invincibility. And so different conditions, I'd say, led to differences in results. I think we can handle both of you. Yeah.
Yeah, so in your level 3 research, there's like a gender differences between their performances in point of death settings. So why,
Okay, so she just asked, well, do I have an explanation for why females found the setback punishment rewarding? I don't currently have an explanation for it that's grounded in research. I would say that in my experience, in looking at weekly gaming, females tend to have less experience gaming and perhaps less confidence, and so they need to see that achievement in order to continue playing. Whereas males who may, and again this is just based on the readings I've done, it's not empirical research, where males may have a little bit, in general, more confidence in gaming, and so they don't have to see that clear progression, or like those clear achievements as females do. But I know when I was talking about this with my husband, I said, obviously people are going to do better on the setback punishment mechanic, and he said, no, point of death. And so it's funny that the results mirror our opinions there, where he thought that, he thought everybody was going to do better in the point of death condition, and I thought everybody was going to do better in the setback punishment condition. Yeah, and then Rebecca?
I was just wondering about the way that, like, for example, like the immortality mechanic is
Invincibility.
Invincibility mechanic was like operationalized. How do you think that it would change things if it was like done in a different way? So like you mentioned that you like filled in the holes and things like that, so you're just like running straight through, as opposed to sort of like when you get the like gold star in Mario Kart, you have like invincibility in.
Yeah,
it's like a different kind of,
it's a different reward. It's actually a different mechanic.
oh, okay.
Although, yes, they're both invincibility. One is because of a reward, and one is simply a basic of the game. So there's a difference of reward in general, but also, I forgot what my other point was to that. I had a good point that just left the room. I think that's it.
Thank you again, Dr. Thank all of you for attending. Really quickly while I have you, I just want to quickly plug the next and last talk in the colloquium series for the semester. We'll be having a talk by distinguished visiting research scholar, I wanted to get her title correct, Dr. Margaret McLaughlin, who will be here talking about technology meant to support family caregivers. That'll be December 5th, this room at 3:30. Thank you all for coming. Have a good day.
Yeah.